Hello and welcome to another episode of Something to Talk About Live. My name is Greg Rokiski. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm PFLAG National's social media and digital content manager. We're so excited to bring you another great show for today. And to kick things off, I'm going to bring on our host for today and my colleague, PFLAG National's Director of Learning and Inclusion, Jean Marie Navetta. Hello, Jean Marie.
Hello, Greg. How are you?
I'm feeling spooky. How are you feeling?
I am feeling super spooky too. So let me ask you, what's your favorite scary movie?
I feel like this is setting me up for Ghostface scenario, so I'm
It
gonna
might
answer
be.
and be terrified. You
It
know, this question is so complicated, and I feel like because I have such a love for horror, but I'm not so much like I will watch any horror movie once, and I have to finish it. I have this weird compulsion, but
agree.
some of the ones that I love are, Netflix's new Fear Street trilogy. That one was as a 90s kid and 90s baby. I loved watching kind of that and taking me an homage to R.L. Stine. I love the Scream series, not for horror, but what they've done for horror in the commentary. So love that you started off the conversation like that. Cabin in the Woods is just weirdly smart in terms of horror and the type of storytelling and the cast and just a little bit of absurdity and camp towards the end. And so I think those are some of them. And then Black Mirror it's not really horror, but it's kind of becoming a little too real with the world we're in right
I
now, although
think
I
it's
am excited that Black Mirror is coming. So I think those are some of my tops as of late.
I love your selection. I was like trying to think about this as I was getting ready, and I was sort of wavering between The Ring and the Supreme Court, and I couldn't decide which one scared me more.
Ooh, it is a toss up. I think a coin toss might not even do that justice. So
It's true, but thank goodness we have like really smart people on to help us through our conversation about queer horror. So I think the two of us, as big
yes,
fans, are in for a good show.
perfect. I'm going to let you to it and let our guests enjoy the spooktacular show. Bye.
Thanks, Greg. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National, and I use she and aya pronouns. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality. And sometimes those conversations may not necessarily be the most political ones. And today we're talking about one of our very favorite things in the whole world, which is horror movies, and to make it even better, queer horror. So before I bring in our guests, let me make sure that you are all set up for today's discussion. We did pick a great article for you. It appeared in the blog A Little Bit Human, and it was called The Queer History of Horror in 9 Movies, and it was written by Rachael Green. We've got a link for you up on the screen at straightforequality.org/discussion series, where you can grab that article and check it out. We wrote some discussion questions if you would like to talk to your friends about this too. But we are not going to just listen to my opinion on the value of Japanese horror films, but we are going to have a much bigger conversation. And for that, I want to bring in today's guests. We have Lotti Pharriss Knowles, who's a filmmaker and self-defined pragmatic progressive, horror fan, and notably crazy cat lady, as evidenced by the... So hello, Lotti.
Hello. Meow.
And we're going to also bring in Michael Varrati, who's writer, director, and according to the interwebs, guacamole enthusiast, but also importantly, a creator of great horror films and queer cinema commentary. And hello, Michael.
Hello. I'm excited to be here.
I am so excited to have you both here. So before we even really get into the conversation, what I would love to hear, and maybe Lotti, we can start with you, is what exactly brought you into this conversation beyond obviously somebody from PFLAG called me and groveled?
Yes, well, that's a lifelong journey, Jean Marie. So I'm not going to go back to the very beginning, but I will say that I often think that love of horror might be genetic, because most of us who love it were introduced to it pretty early. And I kind of think that normal people think, oh, watching people be chased by a mad killer, too scary, don't want to see that. But for some of us, it turns on something in our brain, in our heart, in our soul, that we feel like we just want more and more of it. So my dad did that for me as a wee child. I just kept ramping it up, and culminated sort of in my great life's dream with making a feminist, queer comedy horror film called Chastity Bites that was released in 2013.
And it is pretty fabulous.
It really
is.
Thank you.
Oh, it's true. If you haven't seen it, you definitely should look it up. And Michael, what brings you into our conversation?
Well, much like Lotti, I discovered horror at a very young age. I was watching a program called USA Up all night, which used to air in the late 80s and 90s. And to make a long story short, I started to see these movies that were not the movies that my friends were talking about at school. These were not the films that were playing at the multiplex or that were easily accessible at our local video store. So I became aware that there was this whole other kind of cinema out there. So I think I originally was drawn to the idea that there was something a little forbidden about it. But then as I grew and wanted to be a creator, I discovered that that's what makes horror special. Horror really, when done right, is the most powerful of genres because you can use that dark lens of the fantastic to address things that the mainstream really doesn't always want to tackle head on. In your intro, you mentioned that this is sort of like a sidebar from the usual political discussions you have, but I would argue that horror itself is a political thing because throughout history, we see horror reflecting the day. You know, when there's the argument of God versus science raging, Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein. After the dropping of the atomic weapon, Godzilla is created. Even during the Bush administration and when torture is in the news in the Middle East, we get things like Saw and Hostel. That's got precedent. So as I was going through and become a creator myself, I started interacting with other creators, a lot of whom were queer. And I was like, well, I was drawn to this and they were drawn to this and there must be something to it. So throughout a lot of my work, I've explored that connection. And over the years, I've written a lot about it. I hosted the queer horror panel at San Diego Comic-Con for almost a decade. I have spoken on this topic many, many times because I think inherently horror is queer because horror by definition is a genre of otherness, and who understands otherness better than queer people?
Totally agree. And thank you for making me feel like somehow I've stumbled onto something meaningful and not just a show that I really, really wanted to do because I like scary movies.
It's all of it.
It's all coming together so beautifully to make it look like I'm in control of the situation, which to be clear, I am not. So this week's article, and you know, the topic of many commentary when we start getting into queer horror, it starts by talking about there's been a lot of queer coding in horror movies, historically speaking, and actually going back further than a lot of people even sort of think about it. So where I want to start is for people who have never heard the term queer coding, who might be newer to this conversation. Can we talk about what this means? And can you both give me some examples of how this has shown up maybe in films that people have seen, but maybe didn't consciously realize it? And I will leave this open to whoever wants to jump in first on that.
I'm actually going to have you answer more of this question, Michael, because I think you can speak a little bit more eloquently. But what I will recommend are, I produced a documentary quite a few years ago called Vito, about Vito Russo. And he wrote an amazing book called The Celluloid Closet that in the 90s, a documentary was made of. And that will give you all the background you've ever needed about queer coding in films and queer representation. They don't deal with horror as much, but certainly there are elements that are brought up in there. So,
and thank you for the film about Vito Russo. It was so amazing. And it was like the others, it was the companion to Celluloid Closet. And Michael, please help us out with this one.
Well, it is a big topic, right? And I think that when you look at queer coding on screen, it relates back to something called the Hays Code, which was introduced in the early days of film, which was a long, exhaustive list that could have a documentary all to itself about how certain things in film like sex and smoking and homosexuality and queerness were regulated to protect the audience. And so a lot of times it's not that these elements were just cut out of movies, but they found ways to introduce it without explicitly stating so. And so a lot of what we think of as queer coding begins with the leitmotifs used during the Hays Code, but has sort of transitioned into even modern day. And I think the quickest and best example that everyone can wrap their mind around queer coded characters is something that I call like horror primer characters, and that's most Disney villains. Because most Disney villains have queer coding. They're outsiders, but who are flashy and flamboyant, and their otherness is what sets them apart from everyone. Now, I think probably somewhere along the way, Disney consciously decided to put these elements into their villain characters sort of as a finger wag to society. Like, look at this. These are the bad guys. You don't want to be like them. But what happened is many audience members, especially queer people, were like, oh, but we do. I would way rather be Ursula, the sea witch, than Ariel because she's out there living her best life. But if you look, like Scar from The Lion King has this very fey sort of like what we would consider stereotypical behavior, for better or worse. But those attributes were put into a lot of these villains: Jafar, Ursula, Maleficent giving the best party entrance that every drag queen wishes they could have. And it's sort of manipulating the stereotype into things that we culturally assume to be queer, whether we know it or not. And you see it in, the character in Some Like It Hot, who falls in love with Jack Lemmon at the end. Nobody's perfect, but that queer coding persists through film, and it began with the Hays Code.
Yeah, because one thing I think that surprises a lot of people when they learn this is that before that Hays Code, in the very, very early days of film, and I'm talking from like what wasn't one of the earliest Edison movies of Two Men Dancing, silent movies in the 20s and early 30s, there is all kinds of salaciousness, but also representation of queer people where it's not having to be either coded or made into this other, where, as we know, what happened later was queer characters were either a villain, the other, psychopathic, a victim. They knew something was so horribly wrong about them that the only way for them to get out of that feeling of, horrible otherness was to die, either at their own hand or someone else's. And so it's so lovely to live in a time, even though, yes, we still have struggles. There's still a lot we have to fight for politically, but kids coming up today who see queer so normalized in mass media is just so exciting to me.
Yeah, I agree.
It is. So when I was getting ready for this show, I read article after article after article, and then subsequently watched a ton of movies more. And one of the ones that interestingly came up, and one of my colleagues and I were talking about it the other day, was A Nightmare on Elm Street 2.
Mm-hmm.
Would this be, and would you point to this as an example of queer coding? Because there's been so much conversation about how intentional it actually was, and a lot of stuff that was understood after the fact.
Yeah, I would absolutely consider Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, to be a prime example of modern queer coding. Anyone who's familiar with that movie, or the story of Mark Patton, who's the lead of the film, who subsequently has had a documentary about him made called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, knows
great doc that's about the film and him. Yeah.
It was a journey. And I think that this is a really great example, because I know something you wanted to talk about was queer coding and sort of the reclamation of queer coding. And this is a good example of it, because we know from the content of A Nightmare on Elm Street that Jesse Walsh, the character played by Mark Patton, is coded as queer. And it's a struggle that he has. There's something inside of him that he cannot express. And he is trying to communicate that to his male friend, who's like, look, there's a girl who likes you. Why aren't you talking to her? And the whole kind of arc of the movie is maybe the overwhelming love of this girl will cure him of what his problem is. So even though the movie is now celebrated as this queer classic, or as some horror fans call it, the gayest movie of all time, really the content of it is sort of anti-queer in some ways, because the queer coded character is somewhat punished and has to go on this journey to fix themselves in some way. But what's interesting is that queer coding became recognized by queer people first, because in the 80s, when this movie is released, for folks in the Midwest who maybe don't know what a leather bar is, or don't have the language, because there's no internet to compare notes with people. When they see him go to a leather bar, they're just like, oh, he's at a biker bar or something, and not putting the dots together. There was a whole swath of people, including executives at New Line, who didn't really know that the movie was gay. So it kind of took queer people to be like, oh, it's our secret. Even though it's not the best representation, it's ours. And so this movie that sort of felt anti-queer in text became super queer and embraced, because a major franchise did it under the nose of the world.
Yeah. It's funny watching, I watched a video essay about it the other day, and I remember seeing it when it came out, or seeing it on videotape. And there were elements about it. I had this consciousness that this is not really normal, particularly that leather bar scene, which watching it now as an adult, I'm like, Did anyone really think that was a biker bar? Did you
Right?
see?
It seems so obvious now, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but a point of reference, Bob Shea, the CEO of New Line Cinema, is the bartender in that scene. That's where he put himself in the franchise. Now, I'd like to think Bob knew, but even if he didn't, it's hilarious, you know?
Totally.
It's even better knowing that. So as we sort of move more towards the present, I mean, one of the neat things that you can do if you Google queer horror, you get all these examples of films in which they were either created by queer content creators or, you know, contributed to it. So who is driving this more explicitly queer content effort? Is it queer creators? Is it sort of a combination of people? And what are some of the films that you both would point to as good examples of where we're seeing this representation now?
I feel like it's kind of everywhere at this point. It's sort of, you know, finally, after years and years of repression or only coding or only showing these characters as pathetic or psychopathic or that sort of thing, now it sort of seems like if you don't have that representation, you're kind of out of it, you know, like you're kind of not in the swing of what's going on. So I feel like of course there are people and plenty of movies where there's still not representation, but I see so much more of it. And I love that Greg called out the Fear Street series. I thought that was genius. But yeah, I mean, I think now, like, you know, it's sort of like, you know, if you don't have Black characters, like what's going on? Like why, you know, and so hopefully representation is going to start moving up for everybody else, Latinx, Asian American, Southeast Asian, that sort of thing. But I feel like I'm seeing it everywhere. And like I said, I could not be more pleased for today's youth that they're growing up in a place where no matter who they are, they can see themselves, you know, on screen more. Yeah.
No, I think what's happening too is there has been, in some ways, a great democratization of the content, because we used to take what we were given and we would find a crumb of ourselves in what was presented because it's what we got. But there was not really the means to talk back the way we can now. And that's the blessing and the curse of the internet, is you pretty much can speak your mind and someone will hear it. Yeah. And I think that what's happening is all these marginalized voices are saying we are the audience and we've always been the audience. And there's nothing wrong with telling stories for us now. We've been listening to stories about you and by you and for you and still celebrated them. Now, you know, it's time for a little give and take. And what's really wonderful about this landscape is we're seeing queer voices emerge and come into these spaces and create the stories, because they grew up loving horror and always understanding that it was inherently queer. And they're just bringing love to what they do and presenting it to a new audience.
Yeah. And it's not even like you have to make it a thing of it is part of the plot. So I just went to see Nope last week, which I loved. I really enjoyed it. I had a few questions, but the questions weren't bothersome. They were kind of more like, I can't wait to watch it again. But KK Palmer's character is a lesbian, and it is so casually mentioned. It's like if you blink, you'd miss it.
Right.
But it just is part of who she is. It's casually mentioned, and then it has nothing to do with the rest of the story. And I kind of, the fact that it's so casual now is such a transformation, where it's like, oh, we don't have to be like, oh yes, this person is gay and here's why, and it's part of the story and here's what has to happen to them, and you know,
an element, not the element.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's great too, because I think we're in a space where we can just acknowledge it, as Lottie's saying, because the reality, and I said this at the beginning of the conversation, is that horror has always been queer, always. And a lot of the elements that we had to code or bury in subtext, they were always there, but now we're in a space where we're allowed to say it, and it's about time, honestly. Yeah. But I mean, if you look at the trajectory of horror, even dating back to Gothic literature, before we're even on screen, there's queerness there. I always cite the example that Sheridan Le Fanu wrote a book called Carmilla, which is one of the most famous Gothic literature pieces, and it's about a female vampire who preys on young maidens. And it was so effective that Bram Stoker read it, was essentially a fanboy, and used the basis of Carmilla to write Dracula. You do not get the world's most famous vampire without a lesbian vampire first. And that's just the basis of horror. And the thing is all vampires are queer anyway, because vampires aren't defined by human sexuality. So how could you call them anything but queer?
Yeah.
And that's just the icing on the cake. So now we're just finally able to say it,
Yeah. In fact, it's so funny because you know, Michael knows this. Michael's a good friend of mine and one of my horror buddies that we discover a lot of stuff together.
Yes.
And he knows one of my favorite genres is the lesbian vampire genre, which is a healthy, and I don't mean like sexually healthy, it's that too. But I mean, like, there's a lot of content.
It brings so much kale into the conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, there's so much, and going back, I love that the article, of course, referenced Dracula's Daughter, which is one of my favorites. There's
Mine
quite
too.
a few of my favorites in the genre. But yeah, it's true. Vampire tales are pretty much always about our most repressed sexual desires. And this creature comes along and by biting us, sensual, allows us to live those things out and to have all the constrictions of society. Any shame just kind of falls away once we're under the spell of this. And they always, at the end, at least in the old days, they had to have that spell fall away. Okay, I'm back to normal society. But come on, who didn't really feel like we said with Ursula, living their best life when they were under the spell of that vampire?
It's interesting, Lotti, that you talk about how in the old story structures we had to revert back to normalcy, or just say, this is the other in a bad way. And one of the things about the discourse of otherness in the discussion of queer identity and horror is some folks bristle at like, well, how come the otherness is always a monster? Why is it the creature from the Black Lagoon? Why does it have to be Frankenstein's monster or the vampire? And I always like to tell them, well, that's just one definition of otherness. But otherness can be many, many things, and that's all represented by horror. And when you look at sort of the rise, you mentioned Scream and Fear Street, and one of the things that draws people to those movies are the final girls, the characters that are played by like Neve Campbell, et cetera, et cetera. And if you watch, for example, the original Halloween, the character played by Jamie Lee Curtis, Laurie, she's an outsider. She's got these two pretty popular friends who are sexual and like out and loud, and she yearns to be like them, but she's not like them. And then when the night comes, the thing that sets her apart, that makes her other, is what helps her survive. That's a tale of otherness. That's a queer story. And so that's it. You do not have to be the monster, although sometimes stories paint us that way, but sometimes your otherness is what helps you survive. And that's queer too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I am also really now envisioning that there should be a lot more tribute to lesbian vampires as the cradle of culture.
Oh my God. Yeah. I live for that genre,
Just like want it all to trend. I wanted to finally some recognition for that. So, we have a little bit of time left, and I would be totally remiss if I didn't get two more questions in. And the first one is, people always want to know after these shows, what should they do? Or in this case, what should they watch? So what I am looking from both of you for is your biggest recommendations, especially for those people who might be newer to this conversation, maybe horror fans, but never looked at it in this light. What are sort of those, for each of you, the three biggest recommendations of queer horror, explicit or implied, that you've got for us?
I'm going to give all lesbian vampire movies, and I could give so many more than three, but I'll start with Dracula's Daughter from it's the 30s, or is it the 40s? Michael,
the 30s. Yeah.
The Vampire Lovers from Hammer Studios in England, which was, I believe, 1970. It was around the year I was born. It's right around then. And The Hunger from, I believe, 1983.
That was so good.
I mean, they're just, all three of these movies are interesting progressions through time, but also beautiful movies, intriguing movies, entertaining movies, and movies that are super hot. So my pan self is recommending these lesbian vampire flicks to the audience. So
thank you. I remember seeing The Hunger on videotape. I was very young. and thinking, this exists? This
Yeah.
exists? It just was so ahead of everything.
And it's so sexy.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, I will see your lesbian vampire and raise you a trans vampire. There's a
Woo!
recent movie called Bit, directed by Brad Michael Elmore, about a trans vampire. And I think that this movie is exceptional, especially because we do not get a lot of trans-led horror films. That's still some space that we could do better on and work on and expand on. And I think for the post-Buffy the Vampire Slayer generation, it's a great way to discover queer vampires. I really like, this is probably a harder R for the casual audience, but there was a French movie called Knife Plus Heart, which is a completely queer slasher movie. Everybody in it is queer, and I think it's just really exceptional and beautifully made. And I think that if you want a primer on queer horror, take it back to the mother of midnight movies and watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show, because that is a film that helps people find their community, and that's what this should all be about.
It absolutely is. Yeah, with problematic representation and stuff like that, I want to do an entire show where we just talk about Sleepaway Camp and the history of that film, which is so complicated and yet so fascinating too.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes left now, and I want to make sure that people have a way to know what you're working on and how to follow you and how to find you online. So Lotti, you go first.
Okay. So my Instagram handle, that's kind of the only social I'm on right now, is at Lotti Luhu. On August 15th, the submissions will be open for a new film festival called the 1 Dem Minute Film Festival, which is, the website is in progress, but it's 1demminute.com, and it'll be on Film Freeway. And we are crowdsourcing pro-democratic messaging from certain prompts about common right-wing propaganda and lies that we're all kind of spoon-fed. And we want to get the best messaging possible. And we have some cool people involved who will help get it out to the world, and maybe even as part of campaigns.
Awesome. Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, well, you can find me on at Michael Varrati on Twitter and Instagram. Every Wednesday when we are in season, we're currently on hiatus, I co-host a show called Midnight Mass. Yes, we had the title first, with drag icon Peaches Christ, where we talk all about midnight and cult movies. I also am a filmmaker. I have a new short film called Infested Hearts that's playing festivals right now, as well as I'm in the process of making a feature. And you can also keep up with all my various goings on. IMDb keeps a running list of my projects. I think that queer horror fans would be interested to know that I write and direct frequently on a show called the Boulay Brothers Dragula, which you can watch on Shudder now. So
good. It's so good. And their podcast is amazing. Midnight Mass. Highly recommend it.
Well, thank you both. This was so much fun. This was exactly the show that I think we needed, or at least I know I certainly needed, because the whole world feels a little bit like a horror movie. And so I think talking about this was just so refreshing. And I think there's still so much to say. I mean, I would have loved to have a whole conversation just on what we haven't seen yet and what we need to see. And and maybe I can force you both to come back and talk to me about that one day.
I'm sure you could twist our arm. Yes. But
I would love to do a follow-up on it. You both
keep hope alive, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. I will see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean Marie.
Well, that gets us to the end of another show. So now you hopefully have a whole viewing list of things to see. I know that I have added a couple to my list. Check them out and make sure, as Lotti was talking about, if you've never read The Celluloid Closet or seen the film Vito, make sure that you're also checking that out, because it gives you a great primer in the history of queer cinema, and cinema is queer, period. With that we have to wrap up our show. A couple of quick reminders. If you are somebody that you needs support, please visit us at pflag.org or pflag.org/find to locate your closest PFLAG chapter. And we are still reading with love at PFLAG, trying to replenish all of those books that in a true real life horror movie are disappearing off library shelves. So if you would like to learn more about how to replenish bookshelves with inclusive, positive, great LGBTQ representation, visit us at pflag.org/readwithlove. And that wraps up today's show. We will see you again next week on another Something to Talk About Live. Once again, I'm Jean Marie Nevada. Have a really good week. And as we say at the end of every single show, please remember to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please be kind. I'll see you next week, everyone.